Welcome to the Rational Egoist. I am your host, Michael Liebowitz. And there's some new stuff out about Murray Rothbard and Ayn Rand. There has been letters discovered from Murray Rothbard to Frank Meyer. This has been written about by Daniel Flynn. He did a podcast with Ryan McMakin. One of the people that came up in his article about the letters is today's guest, James Valliant. We're just going to dive right in. We're going to discuss the history of the relationship between Rothbard and Rand, her influence, and these supposed new revelations. Jim, just welcome. I just want to dive right in. Is that okay with you?
Go for it.
Okay. So Murray Rothbard, I don't know exactly how he was introduced to Ayn Rand, but it was in the early 1950s. So we're talking even before Atlas Shrugged is
I
written.
think it was 1954.
It was earlier than that.
Oh, really?
There was earlier than that.
Personally introduced to Ayn Rand?
In 1952, he writes this letter to his publisher. He's working on Man, Economy, and State. This is according to the documentation here.
Right.
So if that's wrong, it's wrong. But the letter I know is accurate. It was actually in my copy of Man, Economy, and State, the letter that he wrote to his publisher. And in that letter, he says, one important source of revision promises to be the philosophical system. For example, in my appendix to the Fundamentals chapter, I deal with the relationship between economics and ethics and had adopted the standard Max Weber position that there can be no science of ethics and that value judgments are purely arbitrary. I have come to believe that there can be a science of rational ethics based on human nature and what is good for human nature. This revision of concepts has already resulted in rewriting this appendix. How far this will result in revision is impossible to state at the present time. Certainly, the general body of praxeological analysis will remain untouched. I am already contemplating changes in the very first section, however, where the axiom of action is defined in accordance with this Randian philosophy. Also, I believe that the philosophy will compel a change in the analysis of labor, its pleasure and pains, derived from Mises's analysis of disutility of labor, joy of labor, etc. So, as far back as 1982, Rothbard 52 is referencing this Randian philosophy and how he is now, he's adopting the Randian view, yada, yada. So then something happens. They have a break of some sort. He leaves the Randy. It's during that time, by the way, 52, 54, where they're having these meetings and debates. George Reisman was there.
What happened was there was an overlap. Ayn Rand moves to New York by 1951, and she's beginning to influence people in that, let's put it that way, milieu of people. And so Rothbard has at least become aware of Ayn Rand's philosophy by 1952. I think that maybe it was not until 1954 that he actually became an associate of Ayn Rand's. I'm not sure, but it was in that period of time, 1952, 1954, that it's correct that he starts revising his utilitarian position and adopting a natural rights position, as we can hear the hints of in this letter to the publisher.
Well, that is actually, now he talks about that, being near her was like being near the sun. She overwhelmed him. She's the greatest mind of the 20th century. I mean, he gives a lot of praise. Atlas Shrugged is the greatest novel ever written.
When Atlas comes out, he wrote,
that's this letter. That's
article that we're talking about says he was just kissing her ass.
Hold on. You always do this to me, and I'm going to kill you in about 30 seconds. Don't get ahead. You're jumping way ahead.
Sorry.
So, okay. So, he continues to talk about how wonderful that this novel is, yada, yada, greatest novel ever written. He talks about Mises, but I want to find there's specifically something that I want to quote because it's very important to quote. I want to make sure that I'm not, I'm not misrepresenting him. I'm not doing any of that. It has to be a direct quote because okay, right here. You introduced me to the whole field of natural rights and natural law philosophy, which I did not know existed. He says this to her specifically, which I did not know existed. Also learned from you about the existence of Aristotelian epistemology, and I studied that and came to adopt it wholeheartedly. So that I owe you a great intellectual debt for many years, the least of which is introducing me to a tradition of which 4 years of college and 3 years of graduate school, to say nothing of other reading, had kept in my ignorance. So that's a direct quote, Murray Rothbard to Ayn Rand. Roy Childs, in his collection of essays, Liberty Against Power, said if not for Ayn Rand, there would be no Murray Rothbard. As recently as within the last 2 years, Murray Rothbard's student, the economist Jeffrey Tucker, told me, and this is on tape, I mean, I don't know what you call it, it's on video, anybody can go watch it, that Ayn Rand made up between, I think he said 3/5 and 4/5 of Rothbard's brain was all Ayn Rand. So I want to keep that in mind. Just park that aside. Now I want to address an issue of the credibility of Murray Rothbard. Maybe he was kissing her ass. I don't know. The reason I don't know is because of his lack of credibility. So Thomas Saz, in the book Faith and Freedom, talks about how Rothbard had written about him. And he says Rothbard turned his thesis on its head, got it completely wrong. So is it dishonest? Is it misunderstanding? I don't know. Milton Friedman says that Rothbard's writing in the American Great Depression, where he's trying to explain how the money supply is increased, Milton Friedman says pure chicanery. Pure chicanery. Okay. They could be wrong, right? But Rothbard, in his essay, The Sociology of the Ayn Rand Cult, talks about, and they talk about it in this podcast with McMakin and Flynn, that objectivists believed in the natural rights of animals. Pure bullshit. Not true. He says that objectivists hold to the axiom of non-aggression. Pure bullshit. Just not true. There's no axiom of non-aggression. I believe he coined the term of the non-aggression axiom. I think he came up with that. That was not objectivist. He says that according to objectivist, emotions stem from irrationality. That's absolutely not true. Right? That's absolutely false. He says that Ayn Rand and In the Circle, they told people not to read works of other authors. But I went to double check this specifically today just to make sure that my memory wasn't screwing with me. In her essay, The Philosophy Who Needs It, which I believe is based on a speech that she gave at West Point, if I'm not mistaken, she actually says you must read other philosophers, no matter how difficult, no matter how much you disagree with them, you have to read them, you have to understand them. So now, of course, Rothbard separates the esoteric and the exoteric. So he, of course, could claim that inside the circle that these things were verboten, and we have no way to verify it. However, Rothbard comments on things that he was in the circle from 1957 till late summer 1958. He comments on things in the Nathaniel Branden Institute that occurred there, which wasn't founded until September 1958, after he was gone. He comments on how Rand reacted to Mike Wallace. Mike Wallace didn't interview her till the 60s. Johnny Carson as well, he comments on, didn't interview her to the 60s. Most of what Rothbard comments on in the sociology of the Ayn Rand cult is at best hearsay. At best, it's hearsay. So given that what I know he says that is false, given these other people who have called him to, out on getting things wrong, given that he's claimed, for instance, that Jacksonian Democrats were libertarians, which is nonsense, given that he said that the United States was the aggressor in the Cold War, which is nonsense, I'm just going to say that we address whatever claims he makes with a hint of skepticism.
Yes.
Right. Now, I want to get to what you're going to get to right now. You had I'm not going to say you were friendly with Rothbard, right?
Very
You
much
knew
so.
Rothbard. Okay. And I also, just for the record, the stuff that Rothbard has written that I know that isn't subject to accuracy checks, I find phenomenal. His economics is absolutely superb. I think some of his criticisms of government are spot on. In the ethics of liberty, I agree with much of it, even though I think much of it is copied or bastardized from Ayn Rand. I like a lot of it. And from what, Jim, you've told me, he was a very nice guy.
In some ways, he was an utterly charming guy.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit about your personal relationship with Rothbard.
Well, it began when I first moved to New York, and my buddy was studying at Brooklyn Polytechnic, where he was teaching economics at the time, and he asked Professor Rothbard if his buddy Jim Valliant can come audit the course, and of course, Jim can get you. Have your friend come. And so I went in and just started attending some of those lectures, and because of my attendance at those lectures, Murray Rothbard invited me to participate in a seminar he was giving through the Center for Libertarian Studies on the history of economic thought. He was at the time writing a history of economic thought. And so I participated. As you know, Professor Douglas Rasmussen was also a participant, at least in several of the sessions of that seminar. And through that, I had an opportunity to get to know him better. In fact, I went out and had pizza with him on his birthday. So I had a very friendly, I was working at Laissez-Faire Books in Greenwich Village, the brick and mortar. They did mostly mail order business. Even before Amazon, they did mostly mail order.
They were wonderful. They provided me with so much, including my first copy of Atlas Shrugged, by the way.
But those guys, there were a lot of anarchists there. You could see Roy Childs in the back of the store many a day. And a lot of the people who worked there were anarchists, and all of them were libertarians. And yet, nonetheless, I worked there. And so I got to know Murray Rothbard. I did. I would say, it was a friendly relationship. And but I did ask him some certain pointed questions. But what was healthy about when I would say, I agree with you about natural rights. And he, in effect, confirmed what you just said. I got that from Ayn Rand. And he was point blank about what he got from it. Now, when you read The Ethics of Liberty, which was, the elements of it were published much earlier, but the book was published, 1982, something like that. You can't read that book without seeing the Ayn Rand influence. Production as the fusion of spirit and matter. I mean,
even the lifeboat cases.
My God, the man was obviously, but something, the other thing that my critique of The Ethics of Liberty is that it's a rationalist construct. Rationalist, and Murray Rothbard had all the features of a classic rationalist.
He never fully even though he was Aristotelian, he never fully purged the rationalism, right?
He never really wanted to understand Rand's deeper method of thinking. Say, like Leonard Peikoff devoted himself to understanding how this lady came to these conclusions, how she integrated a position, what was her mental approach. And if you look at, say, the interesting thing about the esoteric versus that, he's adopting that. Okay, Frank Meyer was an ex-communist.
We're going to get to Frank Meyer in a second. Hold on.
Okay, then I'll leave
Just
that
keep
aside.
telling us about Rothbard.
Well, but what he's doing is he's importing ideas that come from someplace else and infusing them into Ayn Rand. The stuff that's esoteric, that he calls esoteric, was just nuked repeatedly by Ayn Rand in a variety of ways. Her Psychology of Psychologizing article, or you can check out Leonard Peikoff's Understanding Objectivism. It's the philosophical principles. It's not the esoteric stuff where you got to like Rachmaninoff. And see, let me just, these guys who are attacking me, I'm not sure what they're saying.
Well, we're going to get to that too. I want to keep this with a nice logical flow.
A nice logical flow.
So Rothbard claimed that you were subject to being kicked out of the Ayn Rand cult. And by the way, I find it very interesting because one of the things we learn about cults is how difficult it is to get out. But in Rothbard's account, all these people are leaving. And I got to tell you, if as an objectivist, if I'm in a cult, this is the worst fucking cult ever.
Ayn Rand was really bad. That kind of cult thing. First,
we can't even get along with each other.
Yeah. Well, this all comes down to the fact that her primary ethical advice is think for yourself, which is cult suicide. Right? You never in the history of cults is your primary normative advice, think for yourself. And that's Ayn Rand's primary normative advice. And that explains why there's so many disagreements and so forth. And why really you really have to understand how Ayn Rand's ideas integrate and fit together, and how the lady's mind worked, like Leonard Peikoff did, to really get at it. But Ayn Rand's taste in art, this is what I criticized Rothbard for, and it was never addressed in any of these people's stuff when they're talking. I'm not sure what I got wrong. What I'm saying is, when I asked Rothbard a very specific factual question, I read Sociology of the Ayn Rand Cult. You say people were subject to getting booted from the movement if they didn't like Rachmaninoff. Well, who are you talking about? Who was booted for not sharing Ayn Rand's taste in music? He could not give me one name. He could not give me one example of anyone. Now, anyone who goes and reads, like I say, the book Understanding Objectivism, or Leonard's art, course Understanding Objectivism, knows that what Rothbard is calling the esoteric secret doctrine is not objectivism.
Yeah, and you have no problem, right? You have no problem believing that Nathaniel Branden acted in the way that Rothbard says he acted.
Well, I think that, I don't trust Rothbard on the subject, because you indicate that...
Yeah, he's not very credible, but so I'm just saying what you know about Nathaniel Branden.
Point one, I would point you to Charles and Marianne Sure's book, Facets of Ayn Rand, where they give you an actual empirical evidence that Ayn Rand was quite tolerant of people enjoying art that she very much didn't like herself. So just on that factual basis, until they can cough up a name about who was booted for not liking Rachmaninoff, Rothbard factually made that up. And when I confronted Murray about it, he said to me, Jim, it was fictionalized. So out of Rothbard's own mouth, rather than give me an example of someone who was booted for not liking Rachmaninoff, which was my specific question, he said generally that it's fiction. So there are elements of it that are just nonsense. That connects with your point about his credibility. If he's willing in his attack on Ayn Rand to just make stuff up, then we have a major credibility issue.
Yeah.
Got a problem, Houston. And the point is that they've never been able to cough up an example of that. The idea that it was fictionalized was sort of well known and admitted by Rothbard. That's my point. Now, did Murray Rothbard have problems with the atmosphere? I do not doubt that Rothbard had problems with the atmosphere. The emotion, and what's pointed out here in this guy's article, is that he didn't like the emotions and the emotionalism. And it's funny coming from a passionate guy like him. But what got Murray Rothbard passionate was politics. The fact that Ayn Rand had an aesthetic is what bothered him. The fact that it was a comprehensive philosophy. I don't want to buy into all that. That'll hurt me in developing a political cadre of supporters. You don't have to support romantic art, or you don't have to be an atheist. He was concerned about having a big tent libertarian party that would include theists, that would ignore things like art, but that's ignoring Ayn Rand's whole philosophy as a system. But Ayn Rand, when it comes to psychology, read her Psychology of Psychologizing. When it comes to art, no, Ayn Rand did not boot people for their aesthetic values.
But you know what, Jim? The thing that like irks me, I don't even really like talking normally about this. It's just this new freaking, these new letters have been discovered. So they dredge this stuff up.
Yeah.
Let me just tell you something. Rothbard could be 100% accurate about everything he says. I don't care. I don't, you know what I mean? That doesn't affect whether the book Objectivist, the Philosophy of Ayn Rand is accurate.
And I do know that Nathaniel Branden did behave badly, and that
he was
most
a jerk.
of it, he was. When I met Nathaniel Branden, I got the impression that he was a pompous ass.
Which is
now,
what
that does not
Murray
to say
said.
that it's not to say that the Psychology of Self-Esteem isn't an important book.
Great book.
Or the
Again, a great book. Yeah.
Or the essays he wrote when he was with Ayn Rand were great, because those were great too. But the way he handled people, and much of that went under the radar with Ayn Rand. So I have no doubt that, and my impression when I talked about, and this is the way Murray would talk about, oh, you want to talk about the old days? Barbara called me the other day and we wanted to talk about the old days. So when he's talking about the old days and he'd tell me stories, definitely he had a seething hatred for Nathaniel Branden, that was much worse than his criticism of Ayn Rand. In fact, I almost got the impression that he sort of was kind of wistful, that he regrets he didn't continue to have a relationship with Ayn Rand, and that Nathaniel Branden kind of interfered and got in the way of it. But he wouldn't have lasted. He was an anarchist. And the charges of plagiarism, really actually you if Ayn Rand is who you get your theory of free will from, you should cite where you get your theory of free will from, Murray. And that will never change in my mind. His failure to cite Ayn Rand in The Ethics of Liberty is, in my view, a scholarly failure, and again goes to his credibility.
Okay. So you mentioned Frank Meyer, and that, of course, is the person to whom these letters are written. So who's Frank Meyer?
When I was with Murray Rothbard, he would repeatedly say to me, yeah, Frank Meyer was my friend. And he continuously emphasized his friendship with Frank Meyer. Now, Frank Meyer went on quite an intellectual journey from being a communist to being a fusionist on the right. And that's the term. He tried to combine different elements of the disparate elements, the classical liberal element, the traditionalist element, and that's what he was trying to do. So Frank Meyer was greatly admired by both William Buckley and Murray Rothbard, interestingly enough. But he's one of these ex-commies who became, and the 20th century is filled with stories of ex-commies who were moved to the right. But he moved to the right. And the point is that Frank Meyer never had an appreciation for Ayn Rand, okay? Never understood it, even at the rationalist level that Murray did, in my view.
So Frank Meyer basically is one of these guys who was a communist and then ultimately ended up on the far right, a Whittaker Chambers type.
And he tried to reconcile
Max Eastman,
elements.
I think, was one of them.
Max Eastman, indeed. But Max Eastman wouldn't tolerate, he broke with Buckley over religion too. But Frank Meyer was trying to keep everything together. He was a fusionist, which kind of tells you the story of Frank Meyer. He's trying to find a way to reconcile what were disparate elements in the right-wing intellectual movement at the time.
Okay. So we get to these found letters. And one of the things that I found just nutty about listening to the guy the guy who wrote the article on these letters was also on the podcast. And he says, we can now put to bed for all time the idea that Murray Rothbard got natural rights from Ayn Rand. The idea that he did all that schooling in, graduate and blah, 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 and never heard of Aristotle, never heard of natural rights is just ridiculous. And nobody but an objectivist would say it. Okay, well, Murray Rothbard said it. And I just read the letter, and anybody can go find it. It's
and
online.
I have to believe that somehow he independently discovered Aristotle, natural rights, Ayn Rand's particular theory of free will, the way she derived the relationship between a rational nature and our need for freedom. All those arguments he got from, or that volition is a presupposition of all ethics and so forth. All of that he got from Ayn Rand, all on his own, without Ayn Rand, as Ayn Rand is starting to articulate this in New York. No, but if the guy is telling the truth, that he didn't get it from Ayn Rand, then he's calling Murray Rothbard a liar.
Murray Rothbard lied Murray lied in the letter.
Says that he was just lying to Ayn Rand in that fan letter in 1957 after Atlas.
So
we also have on record Murray Rothbard writing a negative letter to the editor, to National Review, when they did a hit piece to the Chambers Go. And Murray Rothbard said, no, you're getting Ayn Rand's ideas wrong. She's not a materialist, Mr. Chambers. And you obviously weren't paying attention if that's what you think. So his letter to the editor was accurate in terms of saying to Chambers, you don't even understand her philosophy. So he was not only writing privately this, he was also writing it publicly in 1957.
Yeah. So he would have had to have been lying to his publisher in 1952.
Yes.
Lying to Ayn Rand then in the letter he writes to her.
Yes.
He must have lied to Roy Childs as well.
And lied to me.
And lied to you and lied to Jeffrey Tucker. Now, I've already said that he's, I don't find him credible. But my main point here is the idea that this guy, Daniel Flynn, puts forward that it was always ridiculous to anybody that he got these ideas from Ayn Rand. Well, then you're just not paying attention. You're not doing due diligence as a journalist.
It is bizarre that ideas you can find in the Fountainhead, or ideas that she wrote in the 30s and 40s in published works and in her private notes, fully developed. Murray Rothbard independently discovered it. That is just simply not credible right there. And then we have all the quotes that you pointed out in letters that we've pointed out to Ayn Rand, which would simply paint Rothbard as a liar on the subject. which also happened to confirm what Rothschild said. And I know what Rothschild said because I knew Rothschild's, and what Murray told me himself. So,
Right.
okay, if that's
So
where you're going on this.
so one of the things that the letters show, again, and I have to say that this kind of in my mind affects Rothbard's credibility, is that he'll write to Meyer and say, "Oh my God!" First he says these Ayn Rand people, this Ayn Rand is wonderful. Then he writes and said this Ayn Rand is terrible. Then he writes and says, "No, I was wrong. It was all me. It's not a cult. It's great." Then he says, "No, it is a cult. No, it's not." So he just goes back and forth, which tells me, well, when do you believe him? Which time is he telling the truth? Or is he just that unperceptive, or is he that subject to, manipulation? I don't know.
Well, I
But
think
his letters don't. Go
I
ahead.
think there was something about the emotional atmospherics in Ayn Rand's circle that bothered him. And I think that's true. If throw the guy here a bone, and you can tell with the correspondence with Meyer that he was uncomfortable. But Ayn Rand is not giving simply a political ideology. Ayn Rand is articulating a whole philosophy, a philosophy that includes an approach to metaphysics, epistemology, a methodology Murray didn't really study, frankly, like the more philosophical types in Rand's movement did. But they're talking in emotional ways about ethical values. They're talking about art and aesthetics, things like that. So Ayn Rand has a much wider philosophy, and just the comprehensive nature of Rand's philosophy will scare some people off. Oh my goodness, they're passionate about all kinds of things. They're passionate about, and Ayn Rand herself was passionate about all kinds of things. That would get people to think, well, this is more than a political movement I'm signing up to. I can understand that. I can understand people feeling, wow, the atmosphere here is sort of a comprehensive one. It was inevitable that Rand would be compared to a religion or a cult, because before Ayn Rand, really, if you're addressing ethical issues the way she is with such clarity and certainty, if you're including with that a whole sense of life and an aesthetic, that's so comprehensive a notion, so life-changing, personally life-changing, that people are going to have to compare it to the kind of philosophical change that can occur in a person when they discover a whole new philosophy. And usually that's a religion. Only in this case, it's one that says think for yourself based on reason and reality. And one that, by the way, says there's aesthetic options, moral options, the parts that Murray didn't get to, which he just assumed were part of an esoteric doctrine. And as I say, that has been put to bed thoroughly by the work of Marianne and Charles Suarez, Leonard Peikoff, Ayn Rand herself, in essays and notes that she wrote that I helped make public. So,
Jim,
yeah.
as I discussed in my own book, View from a Cage, when I was struggling early on with reconciling Austrian economics with objectivism on the idea of value, I came across in a laissez-faire books catalog a book called Capitalism, a Treatise on Economics by George Reisman. And it said that he was a student, personal, of both Ayn Rand and Ludwig von Mises. So I thought, wow, I'm going to get this book. This is going to be a great help. It turned out that Reisman had gone through the same problem I did with the idea of value, which made me feel better. But he didn't help me resolve the conflict. But I did get to read about his interactions with Ayn Rand, how he was introduced by Murray Rothbard, because Reisman was a part of the Circle Bastiat, which was, Rothbard's group of Ralph Raico, Murray Rothbard, George Reisman. I can't remember.
Leonard Liggio, yeah.
Leonard Liggio. But so in this article, the guy talks about how Ayn Rand was browbeating Reisman. And I found it interesting because that's not how Reisman recalled it. And Reisman also maintained his friendship with Ayn Rand, broke with Rothbard, and stayed friends with Ayn Rand to the end. Now, what Reisman says is it's interesting because he actually relates an experience much like Rothbard did in his letter to Rand, that he was basically getting wrecked in these debates. They would have these debates about whether you can have these protective agencies and anarchic governments, which also kind of speaks against the idea that Rand was so intolerant, because she has these guys over making the argument for anarchy, and she's not kicking them out of her her circle. And he says, yeah, she's challenging everything I think, and it made me very uncomfortable. And I can understand that. You're young, maybe, late teens, early 20s, and your entire worldview is being shattered. It's uncomfortable. That doesn't mean he was being browbeated, though. And that's the way the guy in the article does, brings it up. But that's not how it's represented by Reisman. Now, I want your take on this because Reisman, I was in prison, so I don't know Reisman's involvement, for instance, at ARI. I don't know what he's doing in the objectivist movement, but Reisman has remained a part of the objectivist movement, even till today, if I'm not mistaken.
Ayn Rand is still his source of philosophy. He admits quite clearly where he got his philosophy from.
Yes.
And he was part of that Circle Bastia that moved into Ayn Rand's actual orbit after hearing of her ideas and becoming interested in them. But you're absolutely correct. I mean, Reisman, being browbeaten by Ayn Rand, what does that mean? And is it uncomfortable? Are you uncomfortable? I was made uncomfortable. How many times was I made uncomfortable when I didn't understand something, or if it challenged my pre-existing beliefs? For some people, it can be an overwhelmingly difficult thing. But even just say on the point of rationalism, Leonard Peikoff himself, Ayn Rand's heir, talks about the difficulty of disintegrating bad ideas after, Ayn Rand, after years of explaining something, he has to remove it from his psychoepistemology. He has to remove it from his soul, and that takes work. That's not comfortable. That ain't easy, folks. And anytime you're learning something, now get this, it's not like a faith conversion. You have a blinding vision on the road to Damascus like St. Paul, and the scales fall from your eyes and suddenly you're converted. That's not the way it works with objectivism. It's like point by point. And every point you come across that you haven't thought through or that challenges your previous beliefs is going to cause you discomfort, because guess what? It's going to take work to think about it. It's going to take work to chew the idea and to integrate it with the rest of your ideas and to spiral around on it until you really grasp it. And if necessary, disintegrate the bad ideas. So take a concept like altruism. A critique of altruism that Murray Rothbard probably wouldn't have touched with a 10-foot pole. Now he was in theory an egoist, but would he come on a tirade like an objectivist would, saying let me quote Ayn Rand: altruism is a philosophy of cannibals. It's, man eat man, conflict of interest. And so Murray tried to soft pedal some of those issues. Yes, it means I'm an egoist. And yes, it means there doesn't have to be a conflict of interest. But would he emotionally take on altruism as it deserves to be taken on? An ethical principle implies values. That implies passionate emotion. And one can easily confuse passionate emotion with being browbeaten. But if you and I are having an argument and we get passionate, all you're telling me, I don't feel browbeaten when you're making a point about, say, strict construction on Constitution.
I do. You and Pellegrino and Razi.
Constantly browbeating you? Yeah. You feel browbeaten?
Yeah.
But that tells me something about the person's self-esteem if they think a heated argument implies browbeating. What it means is that there's people who care about the ideas and seem to have a real disagreement. Yeah. That's all that means. And when I get emotional, that doesn't mean I stop the argument or I write you off, Michael. Nor did it mean that for Ayn Rand. And I know that doesn't mean that for Leonard Peikoff. So I don't know what to tell you. Yes, could Ayn Rand be passionate and emotional? Yes, she had intense value judgments. Yes, she was a moral philosopher. That's going to imply passionate emotion. Now, as I say, it's particularly ironic coming from Murray Rothbard, who's one of the most intensely passionate people I have ever known about.
Well, he also says that they were all emotionless, basically.
Yeah, exactly.
So Jim,
emotionless robots who were emotional and therefore browbeating me.
So the author of this article actually quotes an appearance that you had on the Ayn Rand Center UK with Jonathan Hoenig and Nikos. I'm just going to say Nikos because if I try to pronounce this last name, Sotirakopoulos. All right, great. So anyway, but you don't chime in until I tell you because you're going to want to jump in. Okay, so they quote you first. Murray Rothbard never cites Ayn Rand once in any of his works in which he defends Aristotle, in which he defends natural rights or free will, ideas he clearly got from Ayn Rand without giving her a single citation. That's end quote Now the author of the article says, Objectivist writer James Valliant claimed on a 2021 podcast. His interlocutor, Jonathan Hoenig, wonderful guy, Jonathan Hoenig, a Fox News Channel talking head, speculated that Rothbard largely fictionalized his accusations against Rand. It's a load of bullshit, basically, just designed to denigrate Ayn Rand because he was called out plagiarizing her. He said to Valliant, am I summing it up? Valliant maintained during the podcast that Rothbard got Aristotle and natural rights straight from Ayn Rand. Now, here's the author's commentary. But in a postcard to Frank Meyer, postmarked October 10th, 1957, 9 months before Nathaniel Branden originated that charge, and shortly before Rothbard became a member of sorts of the collective, the Economist described Aristotelianism and natural rights as long-held core beliefs. Okay, who cares what he says, because we now know that as far back as 1952, he was mentioning Randism. And we also know that in 57, he wrote the letter to Rand.
Murray Rothbard told me he was a utilitarian until he came across the ideas of Aristotle and natural law through Ayn Rand.
So then hold on. Now he says the plagiarism charge heretofore regarded as outlandish by non-objectivists don't care because Rothbard admits it already. But then he says, would seem even weaker now. He goes on, he didn't say now, but he said, furthermore, the imputation that a petty Rothbard libeled Rand and her followers in revenge for their exposure of his plagiarism cannot stand based on these letters that were unsolicited. Okay. What you were talking about specifically was the when in this interview with Hoenig was the Rachmaninoff thing. And that's what he said. So he facially fictionalized it, which is what Rothbard told you personally. Nowhere do you say that Rothbard made up the idea of it being a cult because of this. Nothing. Just all you're saying is that he lied in the sociology of the Ayn Rand cult because he was pissed off. You didn't say he made up the cult stuff. You didn't say that everything he said was new, just that he lied. And by the way, again, they made fun of objectivists for claiming animals have natural rights. That's bullshit. He talks about how objectivists have an axiom of non-aggression. That's not true. He claims that objectivists say that emotions stem from irrationality. That's not true. He claims that they weren't allowed to read other authors going by philosophy who needs it. That's not true. So it is in fact true that he made this stuff up in that letter. And you're saying that you believe that he's making this up because he was kicked out. If he's just making it up for the fun of it, well, that's even worse. So, I don't know, but this author seems to think he's got you nailed. But his argument doesn't hold water.
The sociology of the Ayn Rand cult, which first contained this, or even his earlier written play, Mozart Was a Red, and that was literally fictionalized, but they were both written and published after his break with Ayn Rand. And so one begins to wonder, my specific charge, is that in the letter? Ayn Rand kicks people out because of Rachmaninoff. No, when I see a letter like that pre-exists it, then I will happily withdraw my view, but it's still factually false. It would still be a lie. Yes. It would still be wrong. So until this dude can confront the fact that Murray Rothbard published lies about Ayn Rand, things he knew not to be true, literally fictionalized stuff, then he is in no place to judge this. Stuff he published after his break with Ayn Rand when he was officially pissed off at Ayn Rand. One can easily infer, given the fact that he's going in and out of the Ayn Rand circle in the 1950s, one can easily infer that it was his bitterness over that caused him to not just write it in private letters, but to publish stuff to the world. Now, and make up stuff that just ain't true. So if the guy can, I'll just ask him, can you tell me a person who was kicked from Ayn Rand's orbit for not reading for not liking Rachmaninoff? As for the reading stuff, Ayn Rand was constantly telling people to read it, check it out for yourself. I mean, she was encouraging people to get their PhDs, and they're going to have to read a whole bunch of non-Rand stuff.
Yeah.
And look at the books that she reviewed in her magazines, the Objectivist newsletter and the Objectivist. Sure, they tried to stick with positive stuff, but Ayn Rand could give qualified endorsements to certain works because they weren't fully on board with objectivism. So Jacques Barzun, Eckhart, Isabel Patterson, Ludwig von Mises, all kinds of books that you'll find endorsed and positively with qualifications. So in other words, read stuff that I don't fully agree with was the position in the 1960s, officially.
Jim, before we go, I want to ask you. Well, there's two questions I'm going to ask you, but the first one is this idea because Rothbard I think mentions it. And this author here, I've been reading it all. I might get them a little mixed up, but that Rand was not a reader. Books were not her thing, and this sticks. Right? It sticks because then other people take up what Barbara Brandon says or what Rothbard says, and they hold it as gospel. The woman had a degree in history. She studied some philosophy at university, and she developed an entire philosophy. The idea that she wasn't a reader, it just doesn't hold water for me. What do you know about that accusation?
Well, Ayn Rand would not waste her time if she already knew something. One of the things Leonard Peikoff tells me is that Ayn Rand could read someone and she would read it very carefully. And she could read a history of philosophy, say, and she could get the idea and get it all the way down so that she wouldn't need to read a whole bunch of secondary sources and tertiary sources. Leonard would go on to get a PhD in philosophy, and every time he was simply floored by how Ayn Rand, with very little exposure, nailed it right to the floor. Now, when Ayn Rand died, you could see her library. It was an extensive library. You could see histories of philosophy.
There's also Marginalia, right? They have the book, Ayn Rand's
Marginalia.
Marginalia.
She read Mises, she read Hazlitt, she read all kinds of things. She read biographies of businessmen, U.S. business histories when preparing for Atlas Shrugged. She read biographies of architects and histories of architecture when she was preparing for the Fountainhead. She did extensive research. In her earliest notes, you can see that she was reading all kinds of, she had an interest in Nietzsche when she was young. From her first notes, you can see the dramatic differences between her and Nietzsche. She believed in free will. She believed in Aristotle. She believed in principles. She believed in a certain specific cognitive theory of emotions. Even from the outset, she had major disagreements with Nietzsche, but she was reading a lot of Nietzscheans like Ortega y Gasset, or a whole you could read. She read Mencken, who was one of her favorite authors at the time, Ayn Rand, and she was always reading something. Ayn Rand, now you say Ayn Rand wasn't much of a reader.
Well, I'm not saying it. I'm saying that's what they say.
I know. I'm meaning that in the generic sense. The point is that what do you require of her? Do you require of her to get a PhD? Because that's a ridiculous argument from authority. If you say, well, she hadn't read some lesser work of some obscure philosopher, why didn't she know about so-and-so? Sometimes people would come to her with a thinker and she would say, I'm not familiar with that thinker. Can you tell me about that thinker? She was aware of people like Max Stirner, but she wasn't aware of. It's absolutely true that Ayn Rand did not have the equivalent of a PhD in a variety of topics. That's obvious. But was Ayn Rand a reader? In one sense, she was a voracious reader. And the diversity of the stuff she read was absolutely remarkable. History, art, philosophy. The scope, as I say, of her philosophy indicates the scope of her mind and the kind of scope you'll see in the books she kept through her life. And because I happen to have seen her library shortly after her death, it was very fascinating. I happen to have signed copies of Hazlitt books that Hazlitt signed to Ayn Rand. So the point is, I know that she read, and I know that she read, and if she was interested in someone, she would actually, like Mises or Hazlitt, she would actually dive into their most important books and thoroughly digest them. So
my dogs are howling in the background. Evidently, there's something disturbing them. But one last question, Jim, is what did we leave out, if anything, that you would like to say about this article that discusses these letters from Rothbard to
I think it is. I'll go so far as to say it was impossible that Rothbard did not get these ideas from Rand. Even the language he uses in imparting some of these ideas, as I point out, the fusion of matter and spirit in the process of economic production. I mean, come on! If he didn't get that from Ayn Rand, I'll eat your shirt. Is impossible, simply impossible. And we have affirmative evidence that from letters that he wrote way back then, And we have it from the testimony of people, not just from me, but as you point out, from Roy Childs.
Yeah.
So that is, come on. And when these folks who are, I guess, defending Rothbard can cough up some factual justification to back up the factual claims that Rothbard got wrong, then I'll pay attention. But they don't have it.
Well said, sir. Very well said. Where can people find the great James Stevens Valliant?
Well, you've got another podcast, The Capitalist Corner. I try and watch and listen to that religiously as much as I can.
Every day at noon Eastern, 9 Pacific.
I'm sometimes there. I'm very frequently at the podcast, the Ayn Rand Center UK. And I'm on Facebook, James Stevens Valliant. Hit me up with questions. I'm there almost every day answering questions.
Jim, thank you so much. I've enjoyed this discussion, and of course, enjoy the topic, and I, of course, and always enjoy you.
Always a pleasure, sir.
For now, this is the Rational Egoist signing out. I'm Michael Liebowitz. Till next time.